Okay, everybody ready? Part of this will be a review because I do want to go over the surface editor, and I'm looking at it in layout, even though there's one almost identical to it in Modeler. And they do look identical to one another, and they are in many respects, but they are not the same one. I also today want to introduce something called Viper, which stands for the Versatile Interactive Preview Render, which can also be a bit of a help. I find in some instances it is worthless, only because you still have to render the scene in order to get a final, really clean view of what the surfaces are going to look like when you're done. So, in the meantime, what we're going to start with is in the camera view, we have our texture shaded solid views of these cubes, and this is what they all look like. Now, there's clearly one missing here, and I don't know why that one is missing. I thought I selected the brush metal. Okay. Well, we'll see what it is in a moment. Might be clouds or something like that. Okay, so in OpenGL, you'll notice that the difference between these cubes is minimal. I mean, all you see is just minor differences in color. But if we look over to the right in the surface editor and we start clicking some of the different surfaces, whether it be the brush metal, the cauliflower, if we look at the checkerboard, the transparency built in, if we look at the chrome cube, if we look at clouds, they all look considerably different. In some of them, you'll notice that there's transparency built in, and some of them you'll notice, for example, on the cauliflower, there's bumps built in. Okay, these are called bump maps, transparent maps. There are a variety of ways that we can achieve this. And the way I was taught, or at least it was recommended to me when I was learning 3D modeling quite a few years ago, that there was a fellow named Dallas Good who was a student at the time, but a pretty advanced student, and he said to me, you know what, modeling is really important, and I know that that's what this class is about, is to learn how to model. But he said, if you can do it with surfaces, you're better off. So, for example, instead of changing the geometry to make this look bumpy, if I can do it with surfaces, I'll be better off, because it will be more easily editable. It will also be a smaller file size. So for those of you who are interested in gaming, that would be important. Also would require fewer polygons, a smaller geometry in order to make all of this work. Similarly, if we look at the checkerboard, you'll notice that there's holes punched through here. The other one, the clouds, holes punched through here. Rather than use Boolean or just selecting polygons and deleting them and get rid of the geometry, it's not always necessary. Sometimes it can be done with mapping, and that's what we're going to take a look at today. Now, many of these surfaces that we see here are found under the presets, which some of you have already used. Okay. What I also want to point out, too, is that in OpenGL, the differences look very minimal. So to change that, what we have to do is we need to select render, and we look at render options. And this is where we're going to bring up Viper, and we've already done some of this for our final render of the mic character. If you want to show the rendering in progress, a small size 320 by 240 is good. And you can always cancel it if it's not coming out the way you had hoped. I like keeping this up. The only time I will turn it off is if it's late at night and I've already done a number of test renders, and I'm pretty sure that how the render is going to come out is going to be the way I want it, so I turn that off. And the reason I would turn this off is that it does take additional time for the rendering when you have these turned on. You definitely want, in our case, under Render Display, the image viewer, because that's the image, that little rendered picture that we save when we're done. The last thing that we can select here in this section is Enable Viper. And you can also enable Viper from over here. You don't have to come into Render Options, but this is one way to do it, and I'll show you what it does in a minute.
So what's the difference when you turn on Enable Viper?
You'll see in a moment that we have, because we have not used Viper so far. And you'll be surprised that without actually doing, you have to do a render once. And then after that, when you make revisions to the surfaces, you'll see an automatic update in Viper of how those surfaces are changing. There are many surfaces, though, that it doesn't display in Viper. One that you'll probably want to use, and we a little bit later this semester when I show you how to add sass light or add hair or fur to characters and that sort of thing. That'll be a part of this when we get done with these, maybe the end of this week or next week. It doesn't display that in Viper, so you still have to render it. So for some things you still have to render, and so Viper won't work. And you'll quickly be able to tell, is it being helpful or not? And if it's not, then just turn it off. And unfortunately, if it's not helpful, then you'll have to do what was done in the old days. You just have to render the scene. And you can do a quick render with no anti-aliasing. That will be fewer passes. It will render quickly, and you'll get a ballpark idea of how it's going to look, how the lighting is going to look, everything. And then as you refine your surfaces and your lighting and everything looks the way you want it, then crank up anti-aliasing. You're going to turn off the rendering in progress and just let it render, and when it's done, it'll save the file, and you're ready to go. Okay. And also what I want to make sure that we do too is I want to turn on ray trace shadows, transparency, reflection, and refraction. Now, in many cases, you may not have, in all cases, you'll have shadows. You want to make sure that that's turned on. You may not have any reflective surfaces, so that's not critical. The same with transparency or refraction. But it doesn't hurt to have these turned on. What's that again? Depth buffer, we're not dealing with any of that. No depth, so it's not an issue. And now I can go to render frame. We'll see the rendering in progress, and you'll see how different all of these surfaces look. They're pretty dramatic. And you'll see with the way that the default setting is, there'll be a total of 5 passes. And when this is done, we should see the Viper window, and I don't see it quite yet. So we'll see in a minute when this is done. There we go, abort. So all of these look pretty dramatically different, don't they? Now let me turn off Enable Viper, turn it back on. So where's my Viper window? Come out wherever you are. Let me go back to Render, Render Options, Enable Viper. So, oh, I see it. Never mind, never mind. It's down here under Utilities. Ta-da! There it is. Okay, or now you have to do a rendering first, and now I can click Render. And come on, why aren't you showing this? Draft. Let's look at it normal. Preview. I just want to render. Okay, let me render this again. We'll try it again, and hopefully it comes up here. So just go ahead and render frame. It's not going to change. But I didn't have the window up when I did the render, so maybe that's part of the problem. I don't know. Or maybe I'm just doing something wrong. We'll find out in a minute. You can see, I mean, even as simple as a handful of cubes, it can take a while. There we go. So now it's coming up. I had to render it first. Now, this mirrors what we see here. And what we want to do is, if you want to, and we begin to edit these and refine these, we can come in here and I can put this away for the time being, and then we can come over here. Maybe I've decided, you know what, I've decided to change the color of my cauliflower, that I don't want it to look white. I'm going to make it look orange or something like that. So let's go back up to our cauliflower. And I'm going to click on the texture color here and switch from white to orange. Now notice it changes the color right away. If I were to come back and let's bump is 100%. If I decide that that's too much, I just want a very soft, ripply surface, not a major bumpy one like this. If I turn the bump back or 50 down to 50% or 25%, notice how it's changed considerably. It doesn't look like cauliflower anymore. It sort of looks like bumpy kind of Martian dirt or something like that. So without rendering, I can see on the fly how my surfaces are changing. I can also see in the preview how they're changing over here, how they're supposed to look. Sometimes these don't show everything either. I mean, pretty darn close, but not always. Now, if you recall, by me making those changes, that permanently changes the surface. I cannot undo. If I hit Command Z, it says there aren't any actions to undo. I've stomped on that surface. So this is what I recommend that you do. Let's go ahead and bring up presets. So I go to Window, bring up presets. And I'm going to right click on these because I'm going to delete the ones that are in here for the moment, because this is my working space, except with the exception of my default one. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to restore the cauliflower because I haven't done that much to it. So I'll put the bump surface back up to 100%, and I'll change the color back to white, or kind of an off-white. Okay, so that looks pretty cool. But if I decide to change this, and I'm not sure, you know, I've spent hours building this surface, all I have to do is double click on this preview here, and it adds it to my workspace. Now, what I can do from my workspace is I can create a new library of surfaces if I wish, or I can also move or copy these to other libraries. And to do that, you right-click, and you'll notice that I can move to, and remember, and some of you have already taken a look under these presets. These are the other categories of presets under strange or space, or maybe it's a space texture that I want. So it's a bumpy, kind of rocky texture. I can move it to, or I can copy to. Now, what I can also do is if I right-click just in an open area, as opposed to on one of the surfaces, if I right-click or command-click on an open area, what I can do is under Library, is I can create a library. So let's say I'm working on a project, and it's my space scene, and I want to create lots of space surfaces. So I can go ahead and create library, and I can create the name, and we'll call it space, space surfaces. Click OK. Here it is. Now I can go back to my workspace, and as I'm working on this, if I want to leave workspace up, it's not a bad idea. And then at the beginning of every work session, I can always clear this out and build out new. But in the meantime, I've decided, you know what, I really like this texture. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right-click on it, and I'm going to say Copy To, and I'll put it into Space Surfaces. Now I have one over there. So I'm building my library as I go, and I can go back, and this is another preset now that I can always go back and open. The other thing that you should pay close attention to is that the name of the surfaces don't necessarily correspond with what they are. So for example, if I come over here, I'm going to select the clouds and I like it, and I'm going to double click on it, and I want to add it so that I can always bring it back. And let me see which one the clouds is. Clouds is the one over to the right. So this is my clouds. But if I come over to Workspace and I look at, let's see, let's look at nature or organic. let's look at locust mold or one of these other fuzzy ones here, wild snake skin. Okay, these are some of the nifty presets that already exist for us. And I have this object selected with clouds applied to it. Watch what happens when I double click on wild snake skin. Okay, it should nothing. That's what happened. Yeah, it says load settings. I click OK. And now you'll notice that I have wild snake skin loaded into my clouds object. But you'll notice the name of the surface, it says cube clouds. It does not change the name. So the name doesn't necessarily look, or will not necessarily look the way it is. It doesn't translate when you copy. The name doesn't translate. But as soon as I render this, if I render frame, let's bring this thing back up. Take a moment. Takes a while to do 5 passes. Okay, so I can abort, and so you can get a better look. Let's bring this up. And you can see this looks nothing like clouds anymore. Okay, it doesn't really necessarily look like snake skin either. I'd have to tweak this, but you get the idea. It doesn't look like clouds. What I can do, however, is I can come back over to the clouds, and if I've decided it isn't clouds anymore, I want it snake skin, I can always click on rename. And instead of naming it cube clouds, I can name it cube snake skin or whatever I want so that it corresponds. Okay, but you do have to go in and do that. Another option we have too is depending on what it is you're applying the surface to. We have the option of preview type either as sphere or as in cube. Now, they're pretty generic, and by default, sphere is selected, but what you want to do is try to pick one of the two that's closest to the way it's going to look on your model, so you can get a pretty good overview of what it's going to look like. It's also important to know the sample size, and by default, it's set to 1 meter. Some of you may have already discovered that when you apply a surface to an object, it doesn't necessarily correspond. It doesn't look the way you had envisioned it, mostly because if this is set to 1 meter and maybe the size of the object that you made is 10 meters in height and width and depth, it will look really small relative, the surface will look really small relative to the object that you've built. That's about the only time that you'll really want to pay close attention to surfaces. And it will be a case that, for example, if you were building models for, oh shoot, what was the Disney? There was ants, but then there was the other one where they had their ants. A Bug's Life. Okay. Well, to get the surface to look like they're appropriate for an ant, and you may want the relative size to be 1 millimeter. So that it corresponds correctly. On the other hand, if you're building the surface of Mars and you have something that's several thousand kilometers, then maybe you want the scale to be, or the sample size to be in like 1,000 K or something like that, or a kilometer, so you can get a better relative size from the get-go. You also have the choice here of determining in the preview mode, do you want the color of the background that is chosen, that you've chosen for your background in your scene, or do you just want a generic black background? Okay. If color is really critical, then a black background would probably be better than layout. Okay, because that will give you a little bit more trying to think of the word, unbiased, that's not right, generic look. Because color, the background of the color is going to, of your background, the color of your background is going to influence the way you see color. But if you want to isolate the color in a neutral, that's the word I was thinking of, neutral background, then black would probably be better. If you're wondering why they have checkerboard, is because if I were to select with, let's just layout view, and let's select another one. Let's go back to clouds or Chrome or something with transparency. Cracked color gradient. Let me close some of these. Cauliflower. Well, that's right. I changed clouds, didn't I? So let me go back to peas, underwater, wood. Where did it go? Where did it go? Oh, checkerboard. That's what I wanted. So I click checkerboard. And you do see, you don't know whether the checkerboard texture is blue and green, or are you seeing the blue of the background? But in preview options, if I select checkerboard and I can see through, you know that that is a transparent surface. So that's when checkerboard is used. If you want to turn on anti-aliasing to smooth your preview surfaces, fine. I find it to be unnecessary. Another useful thing to use when you're building surfaces for a particular project is to use scene lights, because lighting is really critical to the way we see color. Really, really critical. So what this does is it will take whatever lights you have in your scene, and it will give you an idea of what these surfaces will look like. It will give you a very close approximation. If I turn this off, you'll notice a subtle difference. And in some cases, it can be a really dramatic difference. And because if you were to paint a red fire engine at night, or have a red fire engine in the middle of the night going down the street, it would not look, the red on the fire engine would not look like at night the way it does during the day. And you want to get a pretty good idea of that. It would be lots of blues in it, lots of violets. You know, it'd be very, very, very little of the fire engine red that we're used to, okay, that you see during the day. So that, using scene lights can be very helpful. The refresh rate we have set to automatic, but we can select to real time. And what that does is that when you come in here and we start to change color, it should change the color automatically in here. Whoops, I mean very quickly. Boom. We can also do it manually, so if you're changing this, as soon as I release the mouse, it should update it. It's not releasing it at the moment. That's okay. I just leave it on automatic. That's fine by me. Okay? So those are the preview options. Something else that I mentioned too at another time is edited by object or scene. And this can be very important too. For our purposes, it's best that you leave it set to object. But at a later date, when you're creating very complex scenes, and the example that I've used in the past, and I believe I used this semester, is that if you were had a forest of 100 trees, and you didn't like the bark color, that it needed to be changed, and you wanted, when you changed the texture titled bark, that it would propagate across all of the trees and change all of the color. Then instead of edit by object, you would edit by scene, so that when you were done, when you changed the surface bark, it would change all of them, boom, in one fell swoop. However, what if you also had a scene with multiple objects in it that were cars, and you had car door left as a texture, but you had cars that were blue, black, green, red, had a number of different colors. If you said edit by scene, and you had car door left for all of them, and you changed the color for one, it would propagate across all of them. That's no good. So then you would have to go in there in a complicated scene, and you would have to edit by object, so that when you looked at the black car and you change the left car door, car door, that it was black and you're going to change it to a gray or something, or a crumpled color or something like that, that it would only change that car door, not all of them in the entire scene. Does that make sense? Okay, I'm going to come back to my workspace, and I'm going to come back to clouds, and I'm going to go back and edit this. The presets that you have, I think, are really wonderful. There are some really great textures in here, and this scene that we have available to us is a pretty good example too of being able to look and to dissect textures to see exactly how they built these. What did they do? How did they create this look for clouds? And the best way to do that is to select the texture, apply it to a surface, and then come over here, and then one by one, tab by tab, go through and look at what they've done. Okay, so you'll see in color, it's really a gray. It's not a white, which is a little surprising. Luminosity is set to 100%, so it actually is, that's kind of interesting. If I were to turn down the luminosity, look at how it changes the clouds. It is that gray texture. By increasing the luminosity, remember when we were talking about luminosity for the lampshade, like it had an interior light source? Well, that's sort of what clouds look like. That because, up in the sky and you've got all of the sunlight shining through them, they're sort of like the lampshade, is that even if there is very little sun, they appear to have an internal light source. So that's what makes that change. Diffuse is how light hits and bounces off a surface. If the surface is totally absorbs the light, then the diffuse and most surfaces will go to black. Now, the only reason this isn't going to black is because luminosity is set to 100%. But if I turn that down, now I have black clouds. And they will never, no matter what color I pick in here, if I were to pick white clouds, it's still going to look black because it absorbs the light. Okay? "100%, 100%. Then the next section refers to reflective surfaces. So let's pick a reflective surface. Let's pick chrome, might as well. Now in this particular instance, no luminosity. Diffuse, in fact, is set to 0, which I find kind of interesting. That if I were to crank it up, now look at it. It just bleaches the whole thing out. So that's something worthwhile noting. Something that I really had forgotten about and hadn't paid attention for some time. But by looking at these textures that are in the presets, you can get a pretty good idea of what you'll need to do to build your own or to construct new ones from this one. You'll also notice that with chrome in this particular case, because it is like a mirror, there's no specular highlights, but the glossiness is set pretty high to 40%, and reflection is set to 100%. That might be a bit too much, but that's pretty much what they have done as a default setting, so that it is a mirror-like surface. If it's a mirror-like surface, then where are they getting this reflection of clouds and kind of a faux landscape down here? Well, if we look at the bump and we also look at environment, we'll look at bump in a minute. Bump is set to 100, but let's look at environment. You'll see, and this is what we used in the last scene, or the last project with Mike, that what they've done is they added reflection options, and when they added a spherical map, which is basically like being in the inside of a sphere. Okay, so if you were to take, actually if you were to look at some old maps of how they envision the world, you would have the world and you would have the sky, and we would be inside that sphere. And that's basically what they're doing. They're mapping it onto a sphere, so no matter where you turn, you have something reflected in that surface, Without that, remember what we did with Mike, it just, if you have a black or a neutral background, it only will reflect what's in that environment. And if there's nothing in the environment, there's nothing to reflect. It doesn't look very reflective. So we're creating an artificial reflective environment. Okay. Also, using the name, happens to be an image map that's used here. If we were to select tinfoil, look what it would do. You know, there's some pretty cool textures and some pretty cool image maps that we have in here that we can choose from. Now, refraction options are different. Refraction options have to do with the way the light is bent when it goes through the surface. So an example of what would be reflective and would bend light would be if we selected glass. So let me see if I can find, do we have some glass here? Glass, glass, glass. Clouds. We have no glass. Okay, so let's go back under our workspace and let's pick glass. Let's go ahead and find one. It's kind of nice in here. How about glass 1? And let's look at our crumpled cube, disgusting cube, dotted cube. Let's take this one and let's turn it into glass. And before I do, I'm going to go ahead, because I'm kind of paranoid, I'm going to go ahead and make sure I add this to the surface. Now let's go back in here. Under glass, and I'm going to change the properties of it to glass. Load settings, and now it's loaded. Now under our environment, they haven't changed any refraction options, but if we go back to basic settings, you'll notice that the transparency is set to almost 100% transparent, but it's not. If it is 100% transparent, then you won't see it. It will be the invisible man. You don't see anything except for the part that's wrapped up. So be careful about turning transparency too far up. Notice the refraction index set to 1. In the manual that we have, which is like a huge telephone book, it has for Lightwave, it has a page of settings that you would use. That if you had a diamond, if you have cut glass, if you had any number of different kinds of glass, if you have water, if you have whatever different kinds of transparent surfaces that exist, you know, gems, all sorts of stuff that bend light, it has the refraction index. So if you want to really accurately replicate what that surface does when light goes through it, then we have those options. It also applied a little bit of translucency, which I find kind of interesting. But, you know, it works. And when we're done, you know, if I were to render this, let's go ahead and render it. I'm not even sure which one of the cubes it was. Let's see. It's really taking a long time now to render. 5 passes. A long, long time. There we go. Actually, I didn't have to do that, but it's kind of hard to see this carefully. If we look at this now, this is what the glass surface looks like now. Pretty cool. So what I encourage you to do with all of these, you know, when you have extra time, just build a cube, just build a sphere or something, a couple of different kinds of objects, and bring up your presets and go through these, and you'll be surprised at some of the really nifty textures there are that you may not need at that moment, but somewhere down the line, you're going to need something that's very similar to it. And you can use this as a basis for your new texture, analyze it, deconstruct it, and then build upon it. And then create your own library and create a variety of things. And you would be surprised at the way some of these look and what they've done to change the textures and customize them. If we go back in some of these, for example, if you want, let's look at the checkerboard again. If you're wondering where did they get the checkerboard, how do they apply that surface, because you'll notice that there's no texture in here except under transparency. So in order to make that transparent, they didn't change the geometry. If we click on here, they applied a map. And they applied a procedural texture. Now this is something else that we haven't talked about, that there are procedurals, and within the texture map, there are procedurals, there are gradients, there are image maps, there are UV maps, there are a whole variety of them. Procedurals are textures that are available to us, and you'll see under procedural type. If we click here, there's a whole bunch of different types here. We have brick, and you'll see how it changes the look of the texture. We have bumpy array. We have the checkerboard, which is what we had a moment ago. We have crumple. We have crust. Okay, so you know, if you keep applying these, you'll see how, hey, that's pretty cool. That's the look I'm going for. Grid, honeycomb, marble, ripples, clouds, smoky. So you get this feel that there's some transparency going on in here. Turbulence is pretty nice too. So you get kind of a smoky looking environment, which would be pretty nice. So there's lots of different ways that these can be applied. Now this is applied, as I said, to the transparent map. The same procedural textures can be applied to a bump map. Now something that I haven't shown you, which is really cool, and this is one thing that I think where Viper really, really excels, is that sometimes you'll have a scene where it could be a single object, but you'll have so many surfaces, you'll forget what you've named them. So when you have Viper and you look at it and you go, you know, I forget what this green bumpy one is. It looks just like the cauliflower one, but I can't remember what the name is. Well, when you click on it, notice that it automatically brings it up. And that will be true with whatever surface you have in your layout, that as soon as you click on it, it will automatically load it in the preview. Very, very nice feature. So that really, really, I mean, that is an excellent. Now this doesn't, even though it says wood, it doesn't look like wood at all. And that's the downside to using a procedural, because it's defined by mathematics for something like wood. It would be better to use an image map, which we'll get to on another day. Because most of all of these that they've applied in here, in order to get the crumple effect, which is very cool, there's a couple of ways that you can create bumpy surfaces. One is to apply a bump map. And that's what they've done in all of the instances in here. There is another way. In this particular way, when they've applied a bump map, and we can look down here under bump, you can see that they've applied a procedural texture, and they've increased the texture value to 200% so that it's really bumpy. You can control the size from here. It's based on a 1 meter sphere. It looks really crumply. And the only thing that's been changed when they use this is that, remember when you select a polygon and you see that little stick that sticks out of it? That's surface normal. It alters that. Okay? That's what bump maps do. We can also, and there's other ways of doing this, that will actually take the same procedurals, or it will take an image map, and what it will do is it will alter. If you have a lot of points on a surface, it will alter those. So it literally does alter the surface. Those are really good for creating mountain ranges and things like that, that without actually going in and trying to manipulate all the points yourself, you can bring in a grayscale image or use a procedural, and you can apply that as a map, not as simply a bump map, but one where it will alter the pixels or the points, and it will move them up and down, and you can create some really nifty, really dramatic surfaces that way. Okay, so that's another thing, bump maps, transparent maps. You can also have translucent maps. Anything that you see here can be mapped either with an image or a procedural. And later on also when we get to gradients, gradient maps and that sort of thing. Why is it important to use the maps? It's easier, and I think the best example, this Wednesday I will do a room with a window, and I will create the window solely with maps. So to create the little glass panes and that sort of thing will be totally with maps. I'm not going to cut out any geometry at all. And that can be pretty nifty. Now that I have one of those middle-aged moments now, my mind went, and I was going to cite another example. It was really cool, and now I can't think of what the example is. Well, I mean, let's look at this one. This is pretty cool. Okay, this is the cute leaded glass. Again, you know, how would you create a model like this? Well, it's done all with textures, and you'll notice the color texture is on the reddish side. Specularity for the highlights is there. Transparency, like glass, is set to 90%. The bump is here. Transparency is the key one. And you'll notice here, in order to get that texture, it applied veins to it in a normal layer so that wherever the veins are is where it remains opaque, and where it's not is where it becomes transparent. So you can create transparent textures, bumpy textures, really alter the surfaces quite dramatically without changing the geometry. Very, very effective. Question? No? Okay. Yes? No? No? Okay. Okay. I'm sure I'm forgetting something. That's pretty much what I want to cover today. And what I'm going to do, see, they've used procedurals in here. On Wednesday, I will use image maps. In order to create the image maps, you need a 2D program. And so what I will do on Wednesday, let me see if it's in my content folder here. I doubt it. Just like we created the face for Mike, I used Photoshop. So that's what I will do for, no, I don't have it in here. Okay. I know where it is. I will have to get it. I already created one, and I will have a before and after so you can see how it's going to look. In the meantime, though, it was to reintroduce you to textures and Viper and the various settings and how you can manipulate control. Use presets to use as a guide for textures that you may want to build and deconstruct, and then develop your own library of textures. And then on Wednesday, I will show you how to create some pretty interesting textures by using image maps alone to be able to create bumpy surfaces, to be able to poke holes through surfaces, all sorts of stuff without changing the geometry. You're only using image maps to do that, but you have to use Photoshop to do it. How many of you, for how many of you is Photoshop totally foreign to you? You have a little bit of idea? Most of you have a pretty good idea? A little bit of an idea? Okay. So then I will do the before and after, and we'll cover from scratch, and we'll build the model. Illustrator will work too, but what you have to do is that you have to export the files as bitmap. For color maps and diffuse maps, they can be in color. Okay, they can be color images, and they can be 300 pixels per inch, and because all of these maps are basically square, 512 by 512 pixels ought to do it in most cases. But for the other maps that we're looking at down here, whether they're image maps or procedurals, I don't know if you paid attention to some of these procedurals in here, but they're all, if we look at veins in here, let's look at something else. Let's look at underwater. They're all grayscale. Okay, so any of these others, whether they're used for bump maps, whether they're used for glossy maps, reflection maps, refraction index, or transparency, you name it, any of these here, when you use image maps in the transparency or in the texture maps, for texture maps, they have to be grayscale. Color won't work. And there was also in the past a glitch with Lightwave in that it had to be a TGA file. It seems now that JPEGs are working, which is what they should be doing. They should work. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. And Photoshop is a good program. I mean, even if you were to work in Illustrator, open it up in Photoshop and do a save as, you know, convert it to a grayscale, or leave it as color and save it as a TGA file. It's a great program for just translating, you know, from one file format to another. It does a great job because you have to convert it to a bitmap anyway. It won't work if you leave it as a vector graphic. Remember the example that I was going to use was if you had a wine bottle or a beer bottle and you have a transparent glass and you have a label on it. The label has writing. The label may have metallic surfaces. You know, I mean, how some beer labels have metallic paper on it. So some of the area is going to be reflective, some of it isn't. Some of it's going to be kind of a crumply texture, like some of the beer labels, and the glass is going to be smooth. Well, it would, again, it could be one object, which is the bottle. That's what you built in Modeler. But all the surfaces, from the glass to the label to the text on the label to all of that stuff, would be a surface texture. It would not alter the geometry. And you can create some pretty amazing things by just, as I say, just maps. That would be a good example. That would be good. Well, you have to make the basic model, and it's generic. But then the surfaces are where the complexity lies. And that would be done in Photoshop or Illustrator, which would eventually have to be converted. Okay? So that's what I wanted to cover today, and I'll do my second part on Wednesday. So everybody should be working on your toy. If I did receive a model from you, whether it be for the table and lamp and or the mic piece, I believe I graded them this weekend and emailed them to everybody. You should have gotten your grades. If you didn't, please check. If you know that you sent it to me and you didn't get a grade, let me know. Okay? Okay.